Hello and happy Friday, students. Welcome to Sociology 228, Cities and Urban Life. My third episode of this web series, I guess maybe I should call it. I probably should have thought of that before I went live. I have two goals that I would like to accomplish today with this video and this recording. First, I am going to visually demonstrate the process you need to go through in order to complete the next step of your project. And this got moved up, as you will remember from the syllabus, because if you look right here at my screen, the American Fact Finder will be offline permanently March 31st, 2020. So we are going to get this in just in time. Okay. So the instructions and an example of what this looks like is posted to the course page. Okay. But it is, I think, somewhat helpful for many people to visually see the steps happen in front of them to know what to do here, because the process of getting city, neighborhood, or county level data is by no means overwhelming. It's not difficult really at all, but there are a lot of little areas where you can make a mistake. And if you make a mistake, you will end up with a data table that is unusable or isn't working for what you want it to. Okay, so there is a link posted to the course page for American Fact Finder. If you click it, it will go right here to this page. What I need you to do is to go down here and click on Address Search. And this box will show up for select geographies. This is where you need to get a little creative. You will need to enter an address that is locally bounded within your unit of analysis, okay? So if I have encouraged you and you have agreed with me that you're going to be collecting city level data, you can just Google a Starbucks in that city and use that address. If, however, you are doing something neighborhood specific, you're going to want to find a zip code and a business, let's say. You're going to need to do a little Googling and find a business, a coffee shop, a library, something that you know is within that neighborhood that you care about. Once you have that address, you simply type it in here. So I'll go with this one, since it's autosaved. Once you type in your address, you hit go. And you will see that a whole bunch of options for geography results will now show up. Pretty much all of you will be using one of four options here. If you want to get neighborhood level data, you will select the census tract. That is geography code 140. If you wanted to do the entire city, you're going to want to click on the city geography code 060. Oh, and actually, it looks to me now, I'm realizing Ann Arbor City, place within state. It looks like, yeah, it looks like you could use either one of those. But if you're doing city, you might want to double check to make sure either one of those would be accurate with what you're expecting to find. If you need county level data, that is geography code 050. And if you need state level data, because many of you are going to need a comparison, then that is geography code 040. I'm going to go at the census tract level because that's what I care the most about. A tract is the Census Bureau's approximation of a neighborhood. So then I will close that window out. And the next step is really important. I'm going to click on Topics over on the left side of my screen, and I am going to expand this data set option, and I am going to grab the data set that I want. If I've encouraged you to just use the most recent data possible, you're going to want to click on 2017 ACS 5-year estimates. However, you will see that there are numerous earlier versions of this data set available. So if you're doing any type of project that involves change over time, it's certainly wise to look at, say, the 2009 ACS estimates or the 2013 or 14 ACS estimates. And if I've encouraged you to think about using the census, the census will show up as this SF1 option. So notice how my cursor is over 2010 SF1 100% data. That is the short form version of the census. So you'd be able to use that one as well. If you wanted 2000 data, then you would be using the short form one here for 2000. And that's as far back as you can generally go. So for now, I'm going to use the 2017 ACS 5-year estimates. And notice how every time I click on this, it goes up into my selections here in the left-hand corner, the top left-hand corner of the screen. And now I am able to use any of these data tables to build my own data table out, okay? So most of our information will be found in table S0601. Selected characteristics of the total and native populations in the United States. By clicking on that, I don't get individual data, but I do get rates. So I can see in this neighborhood, this one particular neighborhood of Ann Arbor, Michigan, 2,791 people live here. The median age, or the midpoint of the distribution here, is 36.2. 50.7% are male, 49.3% are female. 80% are white, 10% are Black African American. And you can see that because Hispanic Latino, that is in ethnicity, not a race. It can apply to people of any racial background. I can see that that has its own separate category. So that would be 3.5% here. I can see the language spoken at home. I can see marital status, educational attainment. I want to look at the median income. I can look at the poverty rate. For those of you that care about the poverty rate, and I suspect that will be many of you, I will want to grab below 100% of the poverty level. 100% of something is that something. So if you are below 100% of the poverty line, that is the percentage of the population that is living in poverty. And right there, just this one table really gives me a really nice picture of what the demographic reality of the city, of this particular neighborhood looks like. Now, if I care about other variables, so for example, one of the variables that I really care about is the, let me just take care of this. One of the variables that I really care about is commuting. I really am interested in how people actually commute to work and back from work. So I am going to type that into this section right here, topic or table name, and I see, all right, let's take this one, commuting characteristics by sex. Okay, let's take a look at that. So I'll click on that table. And I can see that among workers 16 years of age and over, 65% of this neighborhood in Ann Arbor drives to work alone. Ugh, really? I can also look at where people are working. I can look at what time people leave in the morning to get to work. And I can look at what percentage of people have a short commute, a middle type of commute, or an extended commute, right? 4% of this neighborhood has a commute time of 60 or more minutes. That's a long time. Okay, so there's many other tables that I suggest in the instruction sheet. So please do read that, check out those tables, build me the best data table that you can that will help everybody going forward, okay? And so I encourage you, for each of the concepts you're going to engage in, you want to be identifying these sociological concepts that are going to be something that help you explain and answer that research question that you have asked. What you're doing here is getting numbers that back that up. If you tell me that a particular neighborhood in Chicago is segregated, I want to see the racial or ethnic splits. If you tell me that poverty in a neighborhood of Philadelphia, for example, is high, I want to see what the median income and the poverty rate is. If you tell me that there is a skills mismatch within a neighborhood of Los Angeles, for example, I would like to see what percentage of the population in that neighborhood has a college degree. Bottom line, find quantitative backing for your concepts, and we're going to be doing a lot of descriptive statistics work going forward. You do a really good job on this, and it's the one part of your paper that probably doesn't need to be conceptualized as a rough draft. It's very much something that you can take forward and probably just plop right into your paper, and make it something that really empirically documents the existence of some of these trends that you're hypothesizing finding. All right, so that is what I have on this angle, on this part of it. In the interest of wrapping up the week, I appreciate you guys' flexibility in adjusting to online classes this week, and to adjusting to my YouTube lectures, and adjusting to just having to listen to my voice. I will reiterate something I think I said on the last day of class. Having to listen to your own voice played back to you is a special form of torture. So thank you for taking this seriously and working with me. I wanted to just offer some brief comments on what I took away from the video. I have to admit, when I was planning this syllabus, I was a little on the fence as to whether I wanted to assign this video. So this video first aired on HBO a few years back, and it was something that, I watched it. I watched it just kind of on my own time. I was like, yeah, I like that documentary. I do. I like how it ties a present situation to a lot of historical and structural elements. But I was a little bit on the fence about it because I just think about the numbers element here. It's mentioned a little bit in the film, estimates of how many people actually belong to street gangs. And let's be honest, this is not a common thing. Like, the vast majority of us do not belong to street gangs. The vast majority of us will never belong to a street gang. So if you take the estimates at face value, and I realize that that's all these are just estimates, we think that there's about 30 to 35,000 members of the Crips street gang nationwide. And we estimate that there's about 20 to 25,000 members of the Blood Street gang nationwide. And that includes not just Los Angeles and the Southern California area, but nationally, because the Bloods especially have always had a decent presence in certain neighborhoods in New York City, as well as other places. That's just two gangs, though. So if you include everything from these African-American street gangs to any other type of gangs, the Aryan Brotherhood, motorcycle gangs, MS-13, whatever other gang people are generally talking about, it's estimated that about 1.4 million people nationwide are in a street gang. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. It's also in a country of 327.7 million people, something that comes out to 0.42% of the population. So we are talking about a fraction of a percent of the population joining a street gang. That being said, you listen to the stories of people that live in neighborhoods that have a gang presence, and I just feel it's myopic to pretend that nothing is happening. It's myopic to pretend that that's a lived experience that isn't meaningful, despite the fact that most of us don't ever come across street gangs in our day-to-day life. And furthermore, I don't... This is the idea of gang membership. This is often something that's held very unfairly against the entire, gang culture is held very unfairly, in my opinion, against the entire Black community in the United States. And again, if I just look at these numbers, I can see it's a very small portion of the overall population. The reason why I really decided to go along with this and to include this is, again, I already kind of discussed this a little bit by saying it's myopic to pretend that gangs don't exist. It's myopic to pretend that gangs do not have an effect on communities, even if it's a very small portion of the overall population. More to the point, I'm reminded of the work of one of the greatest historical sociologists of all time, W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote a book, a real quantitative and qualitative examination of the Black population in Philadelphia. He spent a whole year living in the 7th Ward of Philadelphia, documenting the lives of the Black residents there, the very segregated Black residents there. And one point he makes there, which seems amazingly modern to me, as something that he very easily and quickly realized from living in this part of Philadelphia, was that you had a city that had poverty that cut across many ethnic groups. Philly was a really interesting case study, as I've said a bunch of times, because not only did it have concentrated segregated Black poverty, it also had concentrated segregated white poverty during that time. If you go back and read Du Bois's work from 100 years ago, one of the points he makes very eloquently is that you cannot judge an entire ethnic group by what he called, and Du Bois's term for this was the submerged tenth, the 10% of any group that is kind of doing the worst, that has the lowest level of education, that might be the most prone to criminality or to antisocial and deviant behavior. What Du Bois realized was that the submerged tent, right, like this kind of subculture of African Americans, was going to be used as an example to kind of deny equal treatment to Blacks across the entire socioeconomic spectrum. And that simply was not going to happen for white ethnic groups, no matter how poor they might have been. Du Bois realized that in Philadelphia in 1899. And I feel like that's still kind of with us today when we think about white rural subcultures that maybe have serious issues with drug addiction or very serious issues with antisocial behavior or institutional distrust. That's not something that seems to be held unfairly against the entire white population. But gang culture does seem to be held unfairly in a way, not to say that every Black individual is viewed instantly as being a member of a gang. Of course, that's not the case, but it does seem that that's a group that has to, quote unquote, answer for what is happening in very disadvantaged communities in a way that white residents just are not asked to. Okay, and Hispanic situation is somewhere in between those two, but probably a little bit closer to the Black experience than to the white experience, even though we know statistically that Hispanic Latino households are not nearly as segregated from resources as Blacks historically have been. And so for that reason, I wanted to really do a documentary on this and do a reaction paper on this, where we start to uncover the structural roots of crime. We start to uncover the structural reasons behind which a very antisocial subculture arises. Okay. So when I was watching the film, I listened to the stories that many of these men, particularly young men here, tell about growing up in their neighborhoods. The stories matter, but what I really cared about was the structure that those stories illuminate. Okay. I heard over and over and over again stories about social isolation. Isolation from many types of mainstream opportunities. One of the stories that really stuck with me over time was the one this young boy wants to go join the Boy Scouts of America, and he's not able to. That is just one example of how the institutions that we rely upon to structure our lives and to connect us to resources simply were lacking for the people that resided in these neighborhoods. So I picked up really on the issue of organizational neglect, right? The organizations neglected these neighborhoods, the institutions neglected these neighborhoods. Except there was one institution of mainstream society that it appears did not ignore these neighborhoods, except the way that they paid attention to these neighborhoods was extremely destructive. And that was the Los Angeles Police Department. Now, this is still true to this day. There is essentially no trust between the LAPD and these low-income gang communities that you see documented in the film. No trust whatsoever. And there is reason for that. There is absolutely reason for that. You can hear all sorts of stories in the film about the way in which law enforcement chose to interact with the residents of these communities. Okay, so we know that we have neighborhood segregation. We know that even with redlining being outlawed and restrictive covenants being outlawed, the segregation stayed in practice. And here's why. If you remember, well, not here's why, there's many reasons why, but the one thing that really stuck out to me was this story about what would happen to really anybody of color if they crossed Alameda Avenue. Remember that story and the police brutality to people that ventured outside of Black neighborhoods and ventured into white neighborhoods was just preposterous. And so what that does, that's the transition from de jure segregation to de facto segregation. You can create this as just the way things are through that type of law enforcement. And actually, now that I think about it, that's even, with the law changing, the actions of the police department there, the Los Angeles Police Department, probably does in some way qualify as de jure segregation. But either way, over time, it's contributed to a feeling of a sense of neighborhoods in Los Angeles, and neighborhoods being their own little pockets throughout a disconnected city, a city that is sewed together by freeways. And freeways may get us, they may satisfy the human need to get from point A to point B, but freeways do not satisfy the need that we have in our hearts to connect to our neighborhoods, right? And to connect to other people and to form an emotional attachment with our cities, all right? So we had social isolation from many types of institutions that really would have maybe helped people become flourishing members of society. We had segregation that was enforced first through the law and later through the actions of the LAPD and later through the actions of the gangs themselves to protect their own little pockets of the city. Third, I saw evidence of a very severe skills mismatch. Many of the people here spoke about the schools spoke about not really having any options, not really having any ability to make a mainstream living. So we don't often think of Los Angeles as being an industrial town, but you can see that LA absolutely still kind of experienced that industrial upswing and then the downswing of what happened throughout the entire country. You add that to the racial tension, you add that to the segregation, you add that to the social isolation, and that creates communities and individuals that are not able to access these new opportunities within the within the economy. Okay, so I see a real skills mismatch right there. And then what really drives the whole thing home, what really kind of brings the whole thing full circle and creates the very violent nature of gangs, is what I was talking about with the drug trade. Drugs, as I said previously, very much destroy communities, and they destroy communities in a way that is very hard to pick up the pieces from. So all of a sudden, not only is there a lot of cash flowing through the neighborhood, we also have kind of the worst that society has to offer around us in the form of addicts, in the form of breakdown, and all throughout the world, different countries are choosing different ways to deal with something like drug addiction and something like the breakdown of institutions like the family. What the United States has done is simply to lock people up. This is what Michelle Alexander, who was a political scientist at Ohio State University, has coined the new Jim Crow, right? Prisons kind of operate as the new thing that creates racialized inequality and does so in an ostensibly colorblind way. But if we simply look at the data, it's overwhelming. 1 in 3 Black men will be involved with it, will be incarcerated in some way, like will be in some element of the criminal justice system at some point in his life. And that is a value, like that's a percentage, that's a rate that is simply not observed anywhere else in the developed world. There's simply no other country that locks up people quite the way that the United States does. If you look at the data on this, it's absolutely stunning. The United States currently has a couple million people incarcerated in the United States. And even though some states are starting to reduce their prison population, other states are actually increasing their prison population. It's kind of an interesting natural experiment of what that does to the state level spending, what that does to the state level of community integration if you reduce or increase the prevalence of prisons within that society. But that's actually besides the point. We have a couple million people behind bars, and those people are going to be coming out. They're going to be rejoining communities, and what happens to them is very much under our control. Also their control as well, but under our control as a society for how we want to pursue something like integration. So if you look at just a few other countries that I happen to know off the top of my head, France currently has 74 people incarcerated for every 100,000 people within the population. In Germany, that value is, I think, 102. In China, that number is between 124 and 172, depending on whether you want to count political prisoners. I would say no, I would choose not to count political prisoners, and that would reduce the number to 124 per 100,000 people within the population. In Russia, which can be a very violent country and a very gang-infested country, you're looking at about 400 people incarcerated per 100,000 people within the population. In Cuba, it's 510. In the United States, it's 724. If you just count the numbers on your hand, the United States has more prisoners, more people in prison in raw numbers than China does, which is insane if you understand anything about the way rates and populations operate. How do we have more people in prison than China? How do we have more of anything than China when you consider that they have 4 times the population that the United States does? And this did not happen by accident, right? This did not happen by accident. This happened through policy. This happened through policy to get tough on crime, 3 strikes and you're out type of sentencing. And if this was something that we all had to deal with, then it would perhaps be a policy catastrophe, but it wouldn't be a driver of racial inequality. That being said, all Americans, if you just kind of count all Americans, the lifetime chance of being sent to prison for all Americans is currently 6%. For all males, it's 11%. For Hispanic males, it's 17%. And for Black males, it is 33%. These are numbers that I want to stress are not observed anywhere else in the developed world. And it is a direct result of our drug policy. It's a direct result of, an opportunity deficit, but I'll get to that in just a few minutes. 57% of the American drug population, 57% of the American population, of the American prison population, is incarcerated on a nonviolent drug charge. So it's clearly one thing above anything else that is driving this prison pipeline. And now, in many states, we are seeing individual state legislatures turn over more and more of prison administration to private enterprise. The idea of privatizing prison, where instead of it being run by the state, it's now being run by a profit-making enterprise. This is profoundly stupid, right? I'm not going to beat around the bush on this. I'm just going to say this is profoundly stupid. Because what it does is it creates a group of people, it creates a lobby in the country that benefits by crime rates being high. And that can't be allowed to continue. We cannot have a situation where one group of business enterprise profits off of everybody else's misery. Who benefits if more people go to prison? Well, the private prisons do. And I guess the prison guards union probably benefits from that in the form of increased job security. Who suffers? We all do. We all suffer when the crime rates are high. But it turns out that minority, and specifically Black communities, really suffer more than anybody else. But we all suffer. We all have a vested interest in this. We all have a vested interest in having a low crime society, okay? And this creates, prisons ultimately create the need for even more prisons going forward, because the recidivism rate in the United States is well over 50%. The recidivism rate is a measure of, if you've been to prison once, how likely are you to go back to prison a second time? Because people are not really able to function. The people are not rehabilitated. In many ways, they're kind of hardened, because what you learn in how to be a member of and survive within a prison environment is not something that's going to help you once you get back into mainstream society. So when I listen to the stories that the men in this film tell, I am struck by 2 things. One, I'm thankful that I was never in a neighborhood and never grew up in a neighborhood where there was a very serious gang problem. But also, I very much see the deficit of opportunity that these people are exposed to. And that is not inevitable. We can construct a society in which the opportunity structure, as Wilson calls it, is more expansive and is more is more attainable for people throughout the country. But as long as we are okay, as long as we tolerate the level of urban and racialized inequality that exists within our country, we're gonna have to we're gonna have to just accept this, right? If we want to have that, like if we're okay having that level of inequality, we are going to have higher crime rates than anybody else in the developed world. We are going to have higher violence rates than anywhere else in the developed world. And we are likely going to have this problem with us going forward, right? Because we are going to have people that go to whatever the opportunity structure that is available to them. So for anybody who takes part in violence, look, again, I am in no way excusing the very destructive behavior of people who commit violent acts. I think if you pull that trigger, if you do harm to somebody, you have to live with the consequences of that for the rest of your life, whatever those consequences are. But I don't need to excuse behavior to be curious and to be interested in where it came from in the interest of creating a more equitable and a more accessible American dream. So I encourage you to think about that going forward. All right. It's very clear to me that there was just a real deficit of opportunity in the neighborhoods that these men grew up in. And I encourage you to think about how that can be alleviated going forward. Thank you very much for listening to me. Next week, we are going to be talking about urban revitalization. Should be interesting. Should be interesting for me, at least. So, hey, thank you very much for listening to me. I wish you guys good luck on everything going forward, and I'll be in touch on Monday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.